Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. The Witchwood Wendigo. Evening came quickly. They'd left home just past noon, but those 8 hours seemed like nothing. Jeremy and Janessa Atwood were alone in the vast Venetia forest. It was the plan to camp out for a few nights, and they had most of the necessary supplies. They'd taken a cab to the start of the forest just outside the border of Witchwood. Had their parents even noticed? "You think you can get this started?" Janessa asked after consistently failing to light the fire. Rubbing two sticks together simply wasn't getting the job done. Jeremy walked over, placed some kindling around the larger pieces of wood along with some leaves. He pulled out a lighter that he'd swiped from his parents' room just before they left. Technology. Sometimes it's useful, smirked Jeremy. "Why didn't you just hand it to me 10 minutes ago?" Janessa groaned. At 16, the Atwood siblings were twins. They shared the same brown hair, though Janessa's reached breast level. His eyes were green, while hers were gray. At 5'4", Janessa stopped growing a year ago, while Jeremy was hoping to add another inch to his current 5'8" stature before adulthood. Jeremy pulled out the necessary ingredients for s'mores. "We should probably consider eating an actual dinner," suggested Janessa. "We can shoot a rabbit tomorrow," joked Jeremy. "Come on, you were supposed to bring actual food along." Jeremy sighed and headed over to his high school backpack. Rummaging through for a moment, he pulled out a small pot and a couple of cans of chunky soup. "One of us is gonna have to hold the pot above the fire. Also, we don't have any bowls." "Ugh. Are you serious? We were kind of in a rush, remember? I just wanted to be out of there ASAP." Janessa grabbed one of the soup cans and peeled it open. "Yeah, same here. Shit, this was supposed to be a family trip." They poured the cans into the pot and Jeremy held it over the growing fire. They were surrounded by trees, but none close enough to risk a forest fire. They'd made a point of setting up a fire in a slightly barren section of the forest. The tent was set up nearby. It was large enough for 4 adults, so the twins would have plenty of space that night. "You want to give it a try?" "There are a couple of spoons in my backpack." Janessa took one out and dipped it into the soup. There was a bit of steam coming for the single curly noodle she'd picked out. She blew on it once before slipping the spoon into her mouth. "Ah, good enough for me," she said. "Great." Jeremy set the pot down on a slightly slanted rock he'd carried to their campsite about an hour earlier. They ate from the pot as the fire died down slightly. Jeremy placed some more kindling and returned to finishing off the pot. There was still plenty of liquid, which they poured just outside the campsite. "Ready for some s'mores?" asked Jeremy. "Nah, I'm pretty full," she replied, brushing off the rock where they just ate and taking a seat. Jeremy had grabbed some chopsticks from the kitchen drawer earlier, which he used to cook a couple of marshmallows. They were slightly blackened on the edges when he slipped them between some graham crackers and chocolate. Janessa looked up in the dark blue sky while her brother ate. A few stars were poking out finally. They were half an hour deep into the forest, with the nearest road an additional half hour from Witchwood city limits. Janessa decided to pull out a couple of marshmallows and make her own s'more. Unlike her brother, she didn't mind keeping the marshmallows as is. The chocolate was decent, but it didn't taste as good as she'd hoped. Nevertheless, it was nice to just have some peace and quiet. Afterwards they cleaned up, and put the supplies back in Jeremy's backpack. They sat together around the fire, occasionally adding another log, or just kindling. "So, have any ghost stories?" asked Jeremy. "Not a ghost story. I was thinking a bit about the alleged Wendigo that supposedly lurks around here." "Yeah, it's weird that they call it the Witchwood Wendigo, even though this is the Venetia forest," replied Jeremy. "It just sounded catchier," shrugged Janessa. "Also, aren't they usually located further up north? I think I heard they're supposed to hang around the Great Lake area and the coast. We're a bit off from that down here. They're just myths." "You think people would actually camp out here if there were actual cases of people being eaten by some large emaciated creature?" "Fair point. Then again, how do we know people just haven't been eaten in this forest? We'd have probably heard about a few missing person reports by now. Maybe even some body parts would have been uncovered. It's just fun to speculate. Kinda scary to think about. I guess that's the same as telling ghost stories. Feeling spooked yet?" "Nah," Janessa shook her head. "I feel a lot better than I did earlier. I'm glad we're out here. Yeah. It's good to get away for a bit. I mean, we left a couple of notes out too, so they know we'll be out here another night." There was another minute of silence between them. Janessa looked up at the sky again. Sure enough, there were dozens of stars filling the sky. They lived in one of the more residential regions of Witchwood, where sky was nowhere near as clear as this. "It would be cool to go into space one day," said Jeremy. "Assuming you can ever get over your fear of heights," teased Janessa. "Hey, I can handle heights. At least most of the time. I just don't like being in an observatory 500 feet off of the ground." "You're right, it felt pretty weird up there. But that was like 5 years ago. Maybe next time it won't seem so scary. I'm not interested in going back anytime soon." "So, still have a thing for Haley Robinson?" "Nah. Kinda lost interest. I don't really have any crushes at the moment. How about you?" "I think Max is kinda cute. Too bad he's gay." "Wait, Max is gay?" "Nah, but he doesn't really seem to care about girls or anything. He seems pretty asexual. Probably has something to do with those bitches back at his old middle school." "What bitches?" "I haven't told you. Max used to get bullied by these couple of girls named Tess and Kimberly. Apparently it got pretty bad, and that's why he transferred down here." "Wow, I had no idea. A big guy like him, I didn't think anyone would try to pick around on. He's kinda shy though. That sucks. Chances are karma will come after them one day. I'm sure of it." There was another silence between the siblings. Jeremy joined his sister in looking up at the stars. She was right. It really was more relaxing out here. Aside from visiting some relatives up in Kentucky, neither of them had been out of Witchwood in close to a year. Spring break was spent around town with friends, while winter break was spent stocking up on groceries just before a surprising blanket of snow. That didn't happen too often in the state of Sanowi. Though it wasn't the deep south, it was southern enough for milder winters and scorching summers. Earlier that day it went up to 93. Even with the sun down, it was still 80 degrees and quite humid. "One more year before we're out of here," said Janessa. "Still thinking of heading off to college?" "Probably. West Sanowi State isn't an arm and a leg, Plus I'd get to be in a big city for once. What about you? Still want to be a detective? I might try and get an associate's degree or something to look slightly more qualified. I know a lot of detectives used to be cops, but I'm not sure I want to take that route. You don't need licensing to be a private eye in this state anyway, so my path is reasonably open. We both kinda have that in common. You want to be a detective too? No. I mean, we both want to help people. I'd rather focus on high school kids. I've been keeping a journal for like a year now. I want to look back in 10 years, and try to remember what it was like being a high school girl. It might help me relate better to students. It's still weird you actually want to be a high school counselor. I guess we're just unusual kids. Remember when Mom and Dad wouldn't shut up to people about how both of us were left-handed? It's better than being in matching outfits like we had back in kindergarten. I wonder how many other twins had to put up with having their childhoods defined by it. Yeah. At least we get along most of the time. It's cool being out here and all. I just kinda wish we didn't feel like we had to rush off. If they worry about us, maybe that'll teach them a lesson. I don't like looking at it that way. Janessa stared sadly at the fire. Hey. Tomorrow's gonna be a good day. We'll head down to the river, skip some stones, and maybe try and catch some fish with our bare hands. Sound fun? Yeah. They smiled at one another. The fire died down about an hour later. It was still relatively early, but already they were tired. Before setting up camp they walked around the forest for a while. Since school ended a few weeks back, neither of them had gotten much physical activity. It was close to 10 when they finally headed into the tent with a couple of push-button night lights. They slipped under their sleeping bags with a couple of small pillows and put the lights out. There were crickets chirping and an owl hooting off in the distance. It was peaceful out there. The sounds acted as a lullaby as they twins fell asleep within minutes. Damn it. It was right around sunrise when Janessa woke to a mild pain in her stomach. She sat up and looked around. That's right. She was out camping with her brother. No bathroom within walking distance either. She moved slowly out of the tent and opened her brother's backpack. Awesome, whispered Janessa. Jeremy had the sense to pack a roll of toilet paper. It was light out, though the ground was still almost entirely in shade. A few early rays of light appeared somewhat distant. She looked around for an area more dense with trees and headed over. About 7 minutes later she headed back with the toilet paper roll in her left hand. Ugh, I really hope he packed hand sanitizer, she muttered. Just then she noticed movement by a tree a few meters to her left. She turned, certain she'd seen some large animal. It seemed as though it was walking upright. No way. What could it have been? Shrugging it off she headed back to the tent. To her surprise, Jeremy was sitting by the now extinguished campfire. I have this in case you need it, she said, holding up the toilet paper. Jeremy didn't reply. As she neared him, he turned away from her. His hair was a bit of a mess and looked longer than she'd remembered. What's wrong? Janessa tried to get a look at his face, but again he turned away. She walked around, but he kept moving away. Eventually she started jogging around, yet he was somehow fast enough to keep avoiding her. Jeremy, what the hell? She stopped after running around him 5 times. Are you mad at me or something? Seriously, why aren't you talking to me? There was some movement back in the tent. Janessa looked over, dropping the toilet paper when she saw what was inside. "Hey. I just woke up. How's it going? What the fuck?" Janessa took a few steps back. Jeremy gave her a funny look. She kept her eyes on him, while pointing to the person who looked and was dressed just like Jeremy. Jeremy looked where she was pointing. "Whoa! Who's this guy?" Jeremy stepped out of the tent, slipping his shoes on. Janessa kept her distance from both of them. "Good morning," said Jeremy politely. Janessa noticed him pull out a switchblade. "You mind telling us what you're doing outside our tent?" The figure stood up. It was significantly taller than Jeremy. Not only was it taller, but its arms were disproportionately long, fingers reaching the ground when it stood at full height. When the figure turned to face them, it still looked like the back of a person's head. There was no sign of a face beneath the hair. "Oh shit," said Jeremy as he headed over to his sister. "Come on, run." The twins raced off from the campsite. They tried sticking close together as they ran. They weren't sure if the figure was following them, and they had no intention of looking back. They ran past trees for several minutes before stopping behind one that was tall and hollow. "Oh my God, it's real," whispered Janessa. Both of them were trembling and out of breath. "Where the hell is the road?" whispered Jeremy, eyes frantically searching the forest. "I don't know. Maybe we can find the trail or something." They walked close together, constantly on alert. "What the hell was that thing?" asked Jeremy, making fists to minimize the shakiness in his hands. "I don't want to find out," replied Janessa. "There, I think I see the trail." They walked in the direction where she pointed, quickly finding a trail. There were no signs giving directions, but they followed it carefully, still watching every which way. They walked slowly, despite their minds screaming for them to run, or even fly if possible. They were lost in a forest with what seemed to be a real-life Wendigo. This couldn't possibly be real, could it? About 10 minutes after hitting the trail, they noticed their campsite nearby. "We just went in a circle, didn't we?" whispered Jeremy. "Maybe we should get our stuff?" suggested Janessa, moving off of the trail slightly. Jeremy clutched her hand tightly. "No way. We need to find a way out of here. We should get some stuff. Maybe we can throw it at that thing if it starts chasing us again?" Jeremy looked around and let out a long sigh. "Shit. I still think this is a bad idea," he grumbled as they headed back to the campsite. Jeremy grabbed his backpack, pulling out the pot from last night. Janessa tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at the tent. It was zipped up again. They exchanged looks and quietly crept away. As they did, the zipper opened. Janessa mouthed something but made no sound. Popping out were a pair of heads. Both had long hair, albeit with bald patches. Their faces were dirty and their skin was an ashy gray. They looked dead. The heads looked around, but didn't seem to notice the twins. Jeremy tugged at Janessa's left hand and the pair took off running again. They raced back on the trail, running as fast as they could. Up ahead, Jeremy noticed something walking past the trees. Its body was severely emaciated, its long arms accompanied by massive hands and branch-like fingers. "Oh shit," whispered Jeremy. He tugged at his sister and pointed in the adjacent direction of the creature. They rushed off of the trail and back into a denser part of the forest. As they ran, they could hear something moving behind them. The sound was getting louder. It was like a large animal stampeding. Jeremy noticed a tall tree with a couple of low-hanging branches. "Up here!" he cried and lunged for the nearest branch. He pulled himself up first and immediately climbed the second. "Come on!" he yelled to his sister, refusing to look back. He must have been 10 feet up when he heard her scream. No. Despite the season, there weren't too many leaves on this tree. He stared down and saw Janessa on the ground. Frantically, she flailed her arms around, trying to push something off of her. But there was nothing there. Nothing that could be seen, at least. He almost called out to her again, but fell silent when her shirt ripped. Claw marks appeared with blood spilling out. Janessa screamed again, while Jeremy watched in horror. A couple of seconds later, her right eye was punctured by something. He watched as the eyeball was pulled from the socket. The screams were unbearable, but there was nothing he could do to escape. There was blood on the right side of her face now, as the creature continued to mutilate her. She kept putting up a desperate fight as her left eye was also sucked out of its socket. Jeremy held tightly to the branch at his chest level, unable to look away. The struggles carried on for several more minutes. The girl didn't even look like Janessa anymore. Her eyes were gone, and a significant chunk of the right side of her face had been eaten away. In spite of this, he could still hear garbled screams as she kept flailing about on the ground. Her shirt had been mostly ripped away, leaving a torso covered in blood and innards. How was she still alive? And why couldn't he look away? The screams finally died down, as did Janessa's movements. The whole time Jeremy couldn't see the thing that was attacking her. It was completely invisible. Was it still the Wendigo? He heard movement, as though something large was walking away. He even saw what looked like massive paw prints appear in the ground below. The movement quieted, leaving behind the mutilated, almost unrecognizable corpse of Janessa Atwood. Her throat had been ripped apart, her innards spilling from her torso, those sockets picked clean. No movement, no signs of life. Jeremy hung on for dear life. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of nightmare. The ground was spinning, so it had to be a dream. This had to be some sort of nightmare. Why wasn't he waking up? He didn't know how long he stood there, but he'd surely spent the entire morning staring at his sister's corpse. He could never leave. If he tried to get down, that thing would do the exact same thing to him. He was alone in Venetia Forest with a corpse and a Wendigo. He'd probably never see his parents again. Janessa certainly wouldn't. And in her current state, they'd probably never see her again either. Hours passed. Jeremy continued to search the forest, listening carefully as ever. There were no further signs of the Wendigo or whatever the hell that creature was. At this point, he no longer wanted to risk looking down. Janessa's corpse was down there. He didn't want to comfort it anymore. He couldn't. His arms were tired, but it was better than being ripped to pieces. Jeremy. No. It couldn't be. From below, Jeremy heard Janessa's voice. But she was dead. Even in the off chance that she was barely alive, she wouldn't last much longer. I can't see you, Jeremy. I can't see anything. Go away, whispered Jeremy. You're dead. You're not real. Go away. There was silence again for another few minutes. Jeremy shut his eyes, resting his head on the branch he was holding. He was so tired, completely drained. Brother, where are you? I can't see anything. His eyes opened, wide and alert. It wasn't real. He had to be hallucinating at this point. I don't want to be stuck like this, Jeremy. Please pull me up. I'm scared all alone down here. Tears spilled from Jeremy's eyes. It must have been guilt. He didn't stop at the first branch. He could have probably helped her up. He could have probably saved her. Then again, maybe both of them would be lying dead on the ground. He tried. Scratching. Something was scratching at the trunk of the tree. I don't want to be alone down here, said Janessa sadly. Jeremy, save me. The scratching grew louder. He held to the tree branch tighter than ever. You're not real, he insisted. You're just a figment at this point. Now get out of my head. The scratching was accompanied by footsteps and what sounded like talking. Jeremy. Save me. Janessa's scream was like that of a banshee. It was hypnotic. Jeremy found himself looking back down. Janessa's eyeless corpse was standing right by the tree, scratching at it with inhumanly long nails. She was looking up at him, most of her face missing, dirt in her hair. Jeremy screamed. Help me! Oh God, somebody! Somebody, I'm losing my mind. Help! Help me! Oh my God, she's dead. My sister's dead. Please don't let me end up like her. Save me. Help me. Rescue at last. Right as he was screaming, a couple of men happened by. Despite their presence, Jeremy remained in a panicked state. He refused to climb down. Close to an hour later, police arrived at the scene. A balding middle-aged cop was able to talk Jeremy down from the tree once Janessa's body had been taken away. Once he was back on the ground, he could barely stand. The cop, whose name was Oscar, wasn't a large man, but he had enough strength to carry the traumatized Jeremy in his arms. Not long thereafter, Jeremy's parents arrived. He didn't speak to them at all that night. Once his feet were on the ground, he'd blacked out. He was taken to a hospital for inspection. He sustained no major injuries, though he'd been physically worn down. He ended up sleeping for 14 hours in a hospital bed. Luckily, he didn't have any dreams that night. Despite yesterday's trauma, he claimed not to recall much of anything that happened. He knew Janessa was dead, but he didn't remember anything else. About a week passed and Jeremy was up in his bedroom. He hadn't left since returning home. His parents hadn't been up to see him either. Aside from some brief conversation at the hospital, he hadn't spoken with his parents at all. Apparently, Janessa's funeral happened earlier that day. He heard his parents talking about it that morning, but they decided not to ask him along. He was unsure how he felt about that. The reality is that he didn't want to go. The last thing he remembered was hearing her talk to someone outside the tent that morning. His parents signed him up for therapy, which he'd begin in a few days. Were they going to try and force him to remember what happened? He didn't want to remember. He sat there at the desk in his bedroom, staring blankly at his computer. All he wanted to do was try and move on. But how could he? He hadn't experienced any nightmares in the week since the incident. It surprised him that he had so little recollection of the events of that morning. Though he wanted to forget, he also wanted to understand. What happened to Janessa? Jeremy reached into his closet and pulled out a brown cap. He'd forgotten to wear it on the trip, even though he considered it a top priority right before leaving. It was probably better that he didn't, otherwise he'd associate it with the trauma. He'd gotten rid of the clothing he wore on that day. He really wanted to distance himself from anything he could remind him of that day. He slipped on the brown cap, feeling the edges. It had been a birthday present from Janessa earlier that year. He felt the need to turn it backwards. It was a change in style that felt right. At the moment, a map of Venetia County was displayed on his computer. He looked at the section labeled as forest. He placed his finger on the screen, causing it to move slightly. "I'll remember eventually," he whispered, eyes unable to look away from the screen. "I want to know what happened to you. I just don't want to find out today." Second story. Don't go Christmas tree hunting after dark in northern Canada. When I was growing up, every Christmas we would go out hunting for a tree. The perfect one, just the right size to put up in our living room. It was always an excursion. Going out into the countryside, crammed into the snow-covered car in our winter wear. My mom and dad, my brother Noel and I. The four of us were an unstoppable team, heading out into the white wilderness to find that one ideal specimen to hack down and drag home with us, so that we could decorate it in tinsel and cover it with ornaments, lights, and all the works. Every year it was our tradition. Until one year it wasn't anymore. Dad passed away a couple years back, and with all this pandemic business, it doesn't look like we'll be doing much as a family this Christmas for the first time I can remember. It was with this feeling of melancholy and neglected nostalgia in mind that I hopped into my car on a whim, and drove out into the snow-covered countryside to find a Christmas tree. The whole thing was a bit out of the ordinary for me. But I was feeling stir-crazy sitting in my apartment. I had just been quarantined for a week due to an exposure at work and had finally gotten back the negative test results and subsequent all clear to venture outdoors again. After days of Uber Eats, watching reruns and old Christmas movies, I could finally leave my house. I couldn't remember where the place was that we had gone to as kids, so I just drove around until I found a farm with a sign out front. It took a couple hours, but I liked that lost feeling, that sense of misdirection that none of us experience anymore since we all have GPS and cell phones. I had turned my phone off and put it in my glove box, vowing not to use it for the trip, instead just wandering until I finally found that sign I was looking for. Christmas trees at red $40 each, bring your own saw. Bios. Perfect, I thought. Just like the old days. I pulled into the frozen gravel lot and parked. It was getting a bit late in the day, so the few people in the parking lot were already tying trees to the roofs of their cars or throwing them in the backs of pickup trucks. "Better hurry," said a man in a flannel shirt and overalls as I got out of my car. "Gets dark early nowadays. Don't want to be stuck out there after the sun goes down. Gets cold quick in these parts." I was immediately struck by his intimidating height. Being 6'5" myself, I don't often run into someone taller than me. He looked down at me, and I thought he had to be above 7 feet tall. His skin was stretched taut over prominent cheekbones, and he appeared emaciated and malnourished. "Thanks," I said. "I haven't done this since I was a kid. Hopefully I still remember how to work a hacksaw." He looked at me crooked for a second, then smiled in a slightly creepy way. His teeth were yellow and nicotine-stained. His eyes looked yellow as well, his skin rough and covered in sores. "You never forget how to use a hacksaw. It's like riding a bike. But remember what I said about the darkness. And the cold. You from around here?" "Yeah, more or less." "Why?" He watched me for another second, chewing a wad of something sticky and brown in his mouth as he did. "Just make sure you're back at your car by sundown. Lots of animals out, and not much to eat this time of year." "What kinds of animals?" "All kinds. Wolves. coyotes. Other things too. I assumed he was the unstable owner of the place, and guessed by his comments that he was slightly insane. One of his eyes was looking at me and the other was staring off into the distance. The parking lot was soon abandoned as all the other cars seemed to leave at the same time as I prepared to go out. Trudging through the snow, bundled up with my hacksaw in hand, I proceeded into the forest of Christmas trees, and he stood and watched me go. Near the parking lot the trees were all too large to fit in my living room. It took a while to get into the decent ones, and I found a lot of the best specimens had been taken. This one had a hole the size of a basketball in the boughs. That one was already starting to turn brown and looked sick. Too small. Too large. Too skinny. Too tall. Too fat. Wouldn't fit. Before I knew it, I realized I was having trouble seeing where I was going. The sun had been subtly setting behind my back. I tripped over something and fell in the snow. When I got up my gloves were damp and I realized my feet were starting to feel numb. It was suddenly getting very cold. Okay, I thought to myself. Just pick one and get out of here. All of the trees looked sick and dying, I realized now. They were missing large sections and none of them looked suitable for use. I settled on a random one after another couple minutes and quickly hacked it down with the saw. By the time I was done, it was pretty much completely dark outside. I thought again about the man's warning to return to my car before it got dark, and started to get nervous and wonder why he had been so insistent. Perhaps there are wolves, a voice in my mind said. Or bears. Maybe there are Wendigos. Why did I have to think about that? As I walked through the knee-deep snow, dragging the sick-looking little tree behind me, I remembered what I had read about them. Wendigos were a creature first mentioned in Canadian First Nations folklore, and I had once done a project on them for school. I discovered through my research that a Wendigo is an evil, malevolent spirit. It is fueled by greed and loves the cold. It prefers its victims hungry, like those found in remote regions during winter months. It possesses people and causes Wendigo psychosis, a condition diagnosed by psychiatrists. Symptoms include cravings for human flesh. Those who are possessed want to eat people. For every person the creature kills and consumes, its gaunt and skinny frame grows taller, thus never feeling satisfied. It is towering in its height, thin, and human-like, but motivated only by greed, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Wendigo tend to appear in the winter, when food is scarce. They love the cold. They are drawn in by starvation and ice-cold freezing despair. My stomach rumbled with hunger. Snap out of it, I told myself. I thought I heard something. Footsteps in the snow behind me. I stopped walking and turned around quickly to look. No one. I began to walk again. The darkness was nearly total, but my eyes had adjusted enough not to trip as I trudged along through the deep snow, dragging the tree by its trunk. That was when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time. Movement of another person walking in the snow. I turned around and the sound stopped. But I had been sure that time. Someone was following me. Hello? I looked around, scanning the shadows in the direction where I had heard the noise. Is someone there? No one. Hesitantly, I turned around and began to march again, my thighs now numb from the cold. My toes had gone from a wet and frozen pins and needles sensation I associated with childhood tobogganing excursions, to now suddenly feeling painful and dead. The temperature had plunged rapidly. I hadn't checked the forecast, but this seemed unnatural, It felt like it was minus 30 degrees Celsius. My breath plumed out in the air in front of me and my hands began to shake involuntarily. Suddenly my teeth were chattering and I was having trouble walking, my legs not wanting to move. The sound was coming behind me again. Much closer now. I turned around and this time it didn't stop. It didn't try to hide. The thing coming at me looked very much like the man from the parking lot, but he was no longer human. Maybe he never was in the first place. His plaid shirt was torn and it looked like he had grown taller than before, and was now pushing 8 feet. Jaundiced eyes full of hate and hunger stared at me as he raced towards me, his long legs making him move quickly in the snow. For a moment I was frozen there. In more ways than one. It felt like the closer he got, the colder it was. And if anything propelled me to escape from him, it was that. I didn't want to feel that freezing dread for 1 second longer. It felt like death. My heart racing, I dropped the tree and ran. The fear I felt as I raced through the snow was indescribable. Have you ever been so afraid that your body doesn't feel real anymore? Your muscle memory doing everything for you, telling your body to run, and you don't even have time to think. You just run. The problem is when there's an 8-foot-tall Wendigo chasing after you and they're obviously hungry and fast as hell. That's when it doesn't matter how quick you can run, because you're still gonna die. I heard him gaining on me, and I knew if I looked back I would die. Just that brief momentary lack of focus would be enough to cause my demise. My heart skipped a beat as I felt it swipe at my clothing and nearly grab a hold of me, and I realized I would never get away by running like I was. I could hear its breath behind me, very close, breathing heavily as it ran. Headlights flashed suddenly, illuminating me, and I heard the Wendigo scream and duck away. The parking lot was to my left, I realized. I had reached it just as the creature was about to grab hold of me. It would have still if not for this one random person pulling into the parking lot. I heard the Wendigo running off back into the trees, clearly terrified of the light. My heart hammering, I walked towards the parking lot. I wanted to thank whoever was in the car, since they had saved me. Even if it hadn't been intentional, it had happened. Interestingly, the car looked familiar, I realized as I walked over to it. My older brother Noel rolled down his window and the expression on his face revealed a total lack of surprise or any other emotion. "Noel. You saved me, man. Thank you." There was something chasing me out there in the woods. "A Wendigo?" he asked. "Yeah, how did you know? And how did you know I was out here?" "Mom told me you went looking for a tree, and there's only a couple places you can go these days. I got worried about you. Don't you remember what Dad always told us?" The memories started to flood back to me. I had forgotten what my father had warned us over and over again. No wonder the advice from the man in the parking lot had been so familiar. "Never go hunting for Christmas trees after dark," I said. But what does that have to do with Wendigos? Man, think about it. Those guys love the cold, right? And they love when people are hungry. What are the 2 things you always remember feeling when we went looking for Christmas trees as kids? My stomach rumbled again, louder this time. Why had I skipped dinner before coming out here? Point taken. My whole body is completely frozen solid, totally numb, and I'm starving. "Follow me," he said. "I'll drive to the nearest burger place and we'll get a bite to eat and get you warmed up." I got into my car with one last parting glance at the woods. Yellow eyes gleamed from the darkness. Maybe I'll get the veggie burger for a while. Third story. It followed me from Seattle. I hope it didn't follow me back. I'm still freaking the fuck out over what happened this last weekend. I think it's still out there. I fucking hope so. This all began a few months ago when I moved here from Wenatchee in eastern Washington to attend a university. I recently turned 21, but I didn't have any friends around to celebrate, so I did the next best thing, rolled a blunt and watched some shit on Hulu. I'm really living the life here, I know. Undeclared major. Recreational weed. Living off my savings, and finally no more parents nagging at my door to do something with my life. Or at least so I thought. The first time I heard it, I thought it was paranoia. I smoke a ton of pot, and living in a new city doesn't help either. People say I live in the party area of downtown. Belltown, I think they call it. So far, it just seems like an endless parade of brothers and drug-addled street kids skulking at all times of the night, and to be honest, it doesn't really bother me that much. I drown that shit out with headphones, anyway. I much prefer it to that cold, deafening silence. The silence so strong you start realizing just how bad your tinnitus actually is. A silence that conjures nightmare creatures from the deepest reaches of your primitive mind to explain the occasional thud and thunk of a settling house. It was in that silence that I heard it. I was grinding some bud for my third bowl of the night when I noticed the empty quiet that filled the space outside of my apartment. I'm on the ground floor, so I'm basically used to all types of yelling, singing, arguing, and fighting when the sun goes down. But not now. Not tonight. There was nothing. Scratch. 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 It came from the window in my kitchen. It's in quotes because it's literally 2 burners and a mini fridge with a microwave on top. Despite what think about stoner stereotypes, I'm pretty fucking immaculate when it comes to cleaning, too. That's why I was puzzled when I investigated the sound. Small amounts of dirt speckled across the small excuse for a counter under the window. The window was closed. I cleaned off the counter and figured I was too high to remember making that mess earlier. Fear was overcome by a wave of relaxation when I hit my pipe. Purple Kush. Family Guy eased me into a coma, and by the morning I didn't even bother thinking about the noise from the night before. But from then on, it kept happening. Night after night after night. The same 3. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Always at different times, too. 1 o'clock, 2:45. 1:37, 3:40. There wasn't really a pattern to it, just the same weird interval of 9 scratches. It seemed to be getting faster every time. I just started assuming it was someone fucking with me. Maybe some guys picked a place to fuck with every night after they left the bar, and I just happened to get lucky. This thought calmed me down, and I was eventually convinced that this was all it was. I still didn't have any friends here, and with the cold snap and rain, I didn't really feel like going out and making any yet. The school quarter was almost over, and I noticed that I wasn't getting enough sleep. The scratching was getting louder now, and joke or not, I had to get some rest before finals week. One of my classmates suggested going camping. She even offered to let me borrow her tent and sleeping bag. Supposedly, getting out of the city once in a while and being in nature helps calm the mind. Kinda hippie sounding, but I was stoned when she suggested it. I took up the offer and made a reservation at a campground near Mt. Rainier for this past weekend. I'd rather not say which one because it might still be there waiting for someone. The girl from my class met me at a Starbucks downtown and gave me her camping gear. I really appreciated the gesture, but I'm not sure if my high-as-fuck monotone voice and glossy red eyes conveyed any evidence of that. Didn't matter anyway. I packed a couple grams of bud, my pipe, and my old Nikon SLR. I got inspired by all the Milky Way pictures people post to r/earth porn, and sleep or not, that was my mission now. The trip out to the park was long. Long, and boring. Saw maybe one gas station for 20 miles, and I may have eaten my snacks on the way there. I stopped there to re-up the trail mix and Cliff Bars and Muscle Milks before I continued on my way. The clerk looked Native American. Old, too. He had this weird look in his eyes when I approached him, as if he was about to say something but cut himself off and silently rang up my tasty treats. It was his eyes, though, that bothered me. He had this look of sympathy and dread and sadness, all molded into one. Maybe I was analyzing the situation too hard, but it seemed like he wanted to tell me something. Whatever, though. I had a galaxy to photograph. The campsite was okay. I pitched the tent fast even though some of the poles were missing and didn't snap all the way. I took a hit off my pipe and looked up at the sky, SLR in hand ready to snap that award-winning Milky Way shot. Clouds. Nothing but a fucking gray sky. Too tired to drive, I got in the tent and listened to a podcast from my phone's speakers. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I did. Eventually. And then I woke up. Atch, scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was scratching on the fucking tent. Get the fuck off my tent, douchebags. And, again, I was met with that cold silence. No one responded. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I was somewhat paralyzed from fear, but in that brief moment I checked my phone to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I refreshed a news app and saw it update in real time. Kind of a dumb way to check that everything is okay, but I guess it doesn't matter. WHE. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Scratch-o-wack. All around the tent, I heard it scratching and scratching to a point where I thought I was just going insane. My heart pounded out of my chest, and my anxiety was at the highest point it's ever been my entire life. Each passing moment of silence felt like another calm to a storm of terror. The scratching and my imagination. I couldn't get out of the tent. I couldn't speak. I waited. And waited. It continued, scratching faster and faster, and suddenly I heard something. Why? Silence. Scratching. T-N-T. The way it spoke. Definitely not normal sounding for a person. The fact I was even questioning the humanity in its voice was reason enough to piss myself. Which I did. For a grown-ass man, I was on the verge of tears. This was too much. I grabbed my car keys and phone, and weed, and unzipped the front flap. I bolted to the car, not looking back as I ran. The keys fumbled around the lock, and I could hear something behind me, turning. It sounded huge, but it sounded like it was on 2 feet. The key slid in, and that's when I remembered I had a clicker. Moment of dumb realization and that I was still relatively high. Got the ignition started, turned the high beams on, and reversed out of my spot to hightail it out of the campground. Nothing in front of me. But I checked behind. Perhaps reflexively, I peeked the rearview mirror before hitting the gas only to see two long, hair-covered legs, illuminated by my brake taillights, making giant strides toward my rear window. I stomped on the pedal. Whatever it was tried to catch up to me, but it gave up after I approached about 60 miles per hour. The drive back was a relief, and a part of me still could not believe what happened. When I got home, it was already morning. The sun was up, and I could see people staggering back from bars and nightclubs. It was a small moment of relief. I felt a little back to normal. Until I got out of the car to get the supplies. Huge gashes were scratched into the window and door, and my tailpipe was slightly bent. At least I'm not crazy, I thought. I lifted up the rear hatch and forgot that I abandoned that girl's camping gear out near Mt. Rainier. My stomach dropped. There's no way she would believe my story. But that's when I noticed something else in the back seat of my car. Dirt. Small amounts of it speckled across the floor and seats. Fourth story. There is something unexplainable in the forests of Oklahoma. The United States is, no doubt, a diverse land of many different forms of life. From the fierce grizzly bears in the mountains of Alaska, to the stealthy alligators in the swamps of Florida. Wherever you may be, there is always something unique about your state. That is until you get to Oklahoma. You see, Oklahoma is without a doubt, one of the most boring places, maybe, ever. Having lived here for 18 years, I'll be the first person to tell you that. Sure, there are large cities, just like any other civilization, however they are spread out over tens, even hundreds of miles apart. What you are left with in between those cities is what some refer to as the sticks or the boondocks or the country, whatever you choose to call it, and that is where I'm from. In the sticks it consists of four main elements: lots of trees, lots of crops, lots of wildlife, and the occasional Walmart or Dollar General. Since there is not a lot to do out here, that is where most Oklahoma residents take up the pastime of hunting, and that is where my story begins. It was a cold November night, right in the heart of deer season. I was laying in bed enjoying a video game I was playing, when there was a knock on my bedroom door. It opened, and my dad walked in. "Hey kid," he said. "Yes, Dad?" "You haven't been hunting this season yet. Why don't you take my bow and I'll get you set up, and in the morning you can head out there, and go kill us something." Wow, he's really putting me on the spot here. I thought to myself. Yeah, sure, why not? I said to him. He told me to dress warm and to meet him outside by the front door in 10 minutes so we could walk out to the spot, so I would know where to go when it was time to leave tomorrow. We began our walk into the woods. With every step we took, I began to get a little bit more annoyed. Where are we going? I thought we were just gonna go behind the house. I didn't know we were gonna have to hike to the hunting spot. Damn, what was I thinking? I should have just said no. When we finally arrived at the hunting spot, we were more than a mile out into the wilderness behind my house. He finally stopped by a huge oak tree and pointed his flashlight at some cedar trees that were off to the side. "Do you see it?" he said. "No?" I replied. He walked closer and shined his flashlight into the trees, to reveal a tiny chair that was hidden under some tree branches and sticks. "That is where you're gonna set up in the morning, got that?" I nodded my head as he tossed out some dried corn, to attract the deer in the morning, when I came back. "What time do I need to head out here?" I asked my dad, expecting him to say 6 to 7 a.m. He then muttered, "You need to be up and ready to head out by 4 a.m. My heart sank. It was going to be pitch black outside. There's no way I was going to be able to make it all the way out here in the pitch black. We finally made it back to the house by 11:30 and I headed up to my room to get as much sleep as possible before this hunting trip. I awoke to the painful sound of my alarm blaring into my dark room. I looked at my phone and it was 3:40 a.m. I sighed and sat up. I put on the warmest clothes I could find and made my way out into the living room. There on the couch sat my dad's bow, 2 arrows, and a small but sharp hunting knife. I grabbed the gear plus a flashlight and made my way out the front door. Navigating the woods at night was an extremely frightening experience that took much longer than what I would have wished. I left my house at 4 a.m. and I did not arrive at the hunting location until 4:37. I was impressed with just how many trees I managed to walk into and how many times I almost tripped over large logs, even with the help of my flashlight. Once I arrived, I sat down in the little uncomfortable plastic chair and began waiting. My dad wanted me out here so early because it makes it a lot easier for the hunter to sneak into his spot and the deer not being able to watch him. I'll never forget the paranoia I experienced in those woods, in the pitch black. The feeling of not wanting to breathe too loud because something or someone might hear you is like no other. After roughly 15 minutes of sitting in the quiet darkness, I heard it. Sticks snapping and leaves crunching. It was a deer walking to my spot. My heart began to pound as I listened closer. The leaves continued to crunch with each footstep, but that's when I picked up on something strange. Is this thing walking on 2 legs? I thought to myself. It sounded just like a pair of human legs walking through the leaves. 5th story. A group of campers went missing in Alaska. I was sent to investigate. If you were to name a monster, I've most likely hunted it. I take assignments that send me all over the world, and I get paid quite handsomely for my work. Monster hunters in my league are few and far between, and I wouldn't recommend calling one of us in for something like a skinwalker, as those are below my pay grade. Occasionally, though, I'll pick up one of those jobs if work is slow. Unlike many of my fellow hunters, I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm more like a private contractor, a private Grim Reaper, if you will. Eventually, I became good enough at my job that my colleagues started to actually call me Reaper, but you guys can call me Lance. It really doesn't make any difference to me. Nicknames don't carry any sort of weight with me. I just consider myself lucky to come back alive after each hunt. Now for the story. I can guarantee that's why you're all here. This is my most recent hunt, and is also my closest brush with death. It started like any other day. I woke up, went through my morning routine, and received the call while I was eating some bacon and eggs out at a local restaurant. The call was your typical missing persons case. A group of 4 campers had gone out into the Alaskan wilderness, and planned on being gone for a week. When they didn't come back 2 days after they were supposed to, the authorities were called in to search the area. They haven't reported back since last night, and with Wendigo season about to be in full swing, I had an idea of what may have happened. Since work had been slow lately, I gladly accepted the job. I wouldn't need anything more than what I brought for most of my hunts, except winter gear, but I always like to be overprepared. My usual gear included heavy-duty gloves, a monkswood plant, a crossbow with 12 bolts, a 9mm pistol fully loaded with silver-tipped rounds, and 2 extra clips along with some basic rations. This time, however, I would be taking my flamethrower along for the trip, as Wendigos and most creatures in general don't care for fire. As for the monkswood and silver-tipped rounds, both the monkswood's poison and silver were lethal to anything I hunted. Something you may not know is that Wendigos tend to behave differently depending on where they live. In the lower 48, they are usually solitary, using their ability to mimic human vocals to lure their prey in. In Alaska and Canada, they completely change up their hunting tactics. What they do in these regions to the north is typically travel in groups of at least 4 or 5 and rush their prey. Whatever the reason, they are far more aggressive in these areas, and I advise you to not visit their territory from mid-October to mid-March. I felt the cold, autumn breeze rustling my hair as soon as I arrived in Anchorage. The man who put in the call was waiting for me at the airport to talk in more depth about what happened. His heavy Russian accent made him hard to understand, but I got the gist of what he wanted to inform me about. The poor soul was worried to death of what may have befallen his daughter and her friends. Where things became interesting is when he told me that he didn't believe it was a Wendigo that had gotten to the campers. I asked what he thought it was, but, in his words, he dare not speak its name. I won't lie. I was pissed. Maybe this poor old bastard had some meaningful information that could help me, but now I had nothing more to go on than before. A normal hunter would have decided to turn back right there. I am not a normal hunter. A massive well of curiosity overflowing with speculation opened up in my mind. I wanted so deeply to know what this possible mystery horror could be. Finally, something had reignited my passion. After years upon years of hunting the same things, I could have some change, some excitement. I wished for this to be the hunt of a lifetime. I came upon the campsite at a time where I'd have about 2 or so hours of sunlight to work with, and it was necessary to move quickly. I had to walk nearly 5 miles from where I parked, feeling watched the entire time. It wouldn't be to my advantage to be stuck out in the night with a Wendigo or whatever other monstrosities stalked the night. There is only one advantage I'd have if it made it to nighttime, surely, it would. The moon was going to be full, so my surroundings would at least be illuminated enough for me to see. If it were a new moon, even a hunter as skilled as myself would be easy pickings. Searching the campsite went as expected. It was completely derelict. Nothing in the woods around me was making a single sound. There was only pure, dead silence. Whatever came through there made a pretty damn good account of itself. Tents were ripped as if they had been through a paper shredder multiple times and were subsequently put into a blender. Droplets of blood were everywhere, staining the surrounding trees and what remained of the tents. Somehow, where the campfire had once been looked like it was used the night before I came to investigate. That meant someone around here was alive and was also smart enough to know that the fire kept the Wendigos at bay, or at least that's how it was supposed to be. A mangled body of a man littered with large gashes and bite marks lay a few feet away from the fire. At first glance, it looked like a cut and dry Wendigo killing. The claw marks were consistent with previous leftovers I've seen, but the bite marks weren't. All of the internal organs of this poor man were ripped out and eaten. Even with all of that, there was no blood from his corpse. This worried me more than anything. No monster I hunted before had ever left a corpse without blood, except vampires, and they didn't devour people's internal organs. Over by the bushes I noticed a young woman and another man in the same state as their friend. 2 more bodies that appeared to be akin to those of park rangers again had the same wounds. They had to be the search party. I scouted some of the nearby trees, and I saw it, the body of a Wendigo that was horribly disfigured. Its emaciated frame was completely broken and its antlers shattered. I knew then I had to either leave or stay and kill this mystery demon. Against my better judgment, I enclosed myself within the campsite, using my flamethrower to create a ring of fire between myself and the treeline. All the while, something still gnawed at the back of my mind. There were 4 campers. 3 bodies. Something didn't add up. A weak, female voice spoke from a tall tree directly behind me. "You shouldn't have done that. The fire brought it here last time." I turned to see her visibly shaking. Her clothes in tatters, her blonde hair a complete mess, her blue eyes full of tears and fear. I felt sympathy for her. I had once been like her in my earlier days. It was my first ever hunt. A werewolf had run me up into an old attic, and I was ready to throw everything away. Its evil, red eyes glare is forever burned into my memory, constantly haunting my nightmares. In that moment, I stood tall and became what I am now, a hunter that shows no mercy to monsters. Never show mercy. They will not return the favor. "Come up here," the girl screamed, having all of her fated life return to her in that single instant. I hesitated. Skinwalkers often deploy this tactic on sympathetic people. However, she was right. No sooner than the girl had mentioned it, I heard something barreling through the trees from my left. It was supernaturally fast. The branches snapped and the pine needles crunched. The beast's footfalls became louder and heavier as it approached. I hastily climbed the tree. It was difficult with my gear, but I couldn't afford to leave any of it behind besides my flamethrower, which I discarded for my self-preservation. Somehow, I managed to elevate myself high to a high enough branch. I guess sheer willpower coupled with the adrenaline produced by unadulterated fear can accomplish nearly any physical feat of strength. The girl made to scream as the behemoth burst into the clearing, but I was able to reach over and cover her mouth, albeit with some strain. In the clearing stood a massive wolf. If I had to guess, he was probably close to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. A light breeze blew through his thick, white hair. A pair of gleaming, evil, red eyes were pointed up at me from the wolf, and his face was curled into a snarl, revealing fangs dripping with a crimson-red liquid. The low-pitched, distorted howl he bellowed was beyond deafening. It was more. It was commanding and primal. The wolf paced around my ring of fire and stepped through it after one full circle. Its hair wasn't singed even in the slightest by the roaring flames. The wolf stayed until the moon had risen high in the sky, staring into my soul with its evil eyes the entire time, but once I could hear the trees rustling in the distance and the unmistakable shrieks of Wendigos, the wolf left. Knowing these monsters as I did, I knew he would come back. He wanted both of us dead, but why hadn't he already killed us? Surely, he had enough strength to ram the tree and knock it down, taking us with it and providing an easy meal. The beast could have leaped up with his powerful legs and kept doing so until one of us was pulled down along with him. As I tried to think of a way out of our predicament, the girl spoke to me for the first time in hours. "Why are you here?" she asked, making the defeat she felt audible. "Some Russian guy called me to find out what happened to you guys. The better question is, how did you survive?" I questioned in return. "So Natalia's dad sent you?" "I lived because they died. That thing almost got me, too, but it snagged my jacket instead. I've been up here for 3 days." I could feel the tears well up in my eyes. Luckily, I still had my pack with me. I pulled out a piece of jerky and a water bottle and handed it to her. "Here. You need this more than I do. May I get your name?" She quickly, but gratefully snatched it and started eating and drinking. "I know it's not much, but I won't let you die, not if I can help it." Her voice perked up a bit after having her meager sustenance. "My name's Jillian and thank you. I thought I'd starve up here. I hate to have to do this, but what do you know about that wolf?" "It's called the Wahila. My friend John's grandpa told us about it." "I'm sorry, but that's all I know." Shit, I thought to myself, trying not to look worried, which I could tell wasn't working due to Jillian becoming more worried herself. Every other hunter that had been sent after a Wahila never came back. These are the top of the game in North America. No matter how long it takes, they always kill something they set their sights on, and now we were likely its next form of food when it came back. At that time, not a single person had ever documented its abilities. There was only speculation as to what it could do. I've seen firsthand what it leaves behind, and unless you have a death wish, never go after the Wahila. "What's wrong?" she asked, wanting to know what someone like me could possibly be afraid of. "It's nothing," I lied to no avail. "You might as well tell me. We either leave alive, or we die," she declared with that same fire I used to have in my early days. "All right. I'll tell you, but you won't like it. I'm one of the top monster hunters out there. People pay a pretty penny for guys like me to do this stuff, and as good as I am, as good as other hunters like me are. None of us have ever come back from hunting the Wahila." Strangely, this didn't faze her optimism. Her will to live burned brighter than the still raging ring of fire below. That lit a new fire in me. I had to get us out of here alive. "Who said you wouldn't be the first?" Jillian said, reaffirming my newfound resolve. God, she reminded me so much of the woman I began my hunting career for. When I was 19, we went out camping together in the Appalachians, just the two of us. A skinwalker took her from me, and I vowed to avenge her. I know it's like some overdone movie cliché, but it's a cliché for a reason. We as humans have the drive to get revenge for our comrades and loved ones. That skinwalker ended up being the second demon I killed after that werewolf. It was like a rite of passage. Killing that bastard though, I knew there was no going back after having done it. Here I was 7 years later, watching someone go through what I did. Maybe, in a way, my girl did come back to me. "You know, maybe you're right," I agreed with her, much to her delight. Now I was determined more than ever to come back alive. I opened one of the pockets on my pack and put on my gloves. Then, I opened a second pocket and carefully removed the monkswood plant. Using what was left of the water, I distilled it, as the Wahila can smell even the faintest scent of it. I tipped my crossbow bolts with my concoction and waited. There would only be time for one shot before the massive wolf knew what we were trying to do if it didn't already. I turned to Jillian and told her, handing her my 9mm, "Be quiet no matter what you see or hear. If something happens to me, I need you to run. Just make it out of the forest. I can buy you enough time for that." She nodded in compliance. It warmed my heart knowing at least one of us would survive the night, although I didn't want to die myself. What felt like another 2 or so hours passed. The fire had long since burned itself out, and the sun was rising. Then, we heard it. A Wendigo was making its way towards our clearing. From its frantic-sounding movements, the Wahila was dead on its trail. As soon as the Wendigo broke the tree line, it would be over. Sure enough, the Wahila pounced on it just as predicted. This was my chance. I shot my crossbow. Direct hit. The bolt lodged itself between the massive wolf's shoulder blades as it eviscerated its prey. Its howl echoed throughout the forest, making it sound as if the forest itself was in pain. The potent poison would need a few minutes to work its way throughout the Wahila's massive body, as it scampered away. The Wendigo was still alive, letting out its loud shrieks of anguish as it crawled to the base of our tree and began climbing. Before I could reload my crossbow, I heard the crack of a gunshot. Between the demon's eyes was a smoking hole. It no longer moved, save for a couple twitches. Jillian and I climbed down the tree and sprinted in the direction of the trailhead. The feeling of being watched was following us the entire way until we reached the last clearing before the beginning of the trail. The menacing presence that had been stalking us was standing in the center of the clearing. Stumbling towards us was the Wahila, crossbow bolt still wedged in its back. It was clearly succumbing to the poison, but even that wouldn't stop this hellhound from its endeavor to murder us. Jillian froze. I wrenched the pistol from her firm grip as the monster charged us, teeth bared, red eyes glaring, and mouth frothing. One shot was all it took. It was over. The Wahila's body seized up, and it dropped to the ground with a resounding, satisfying thud. We made it to the truck I pulled up in the day prior. I radioed someone nearby and told them about what they had to retrieve from the forest. At first they sounded skeptical. This wasn't the person intended to receive the message, but after some fumbling with the radio on the other end, we were given the green light to leave the area. I don't know if it was my imagination or not, but I swear I saw a pair of red eyes watching us leave. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.